All right, folks, it's about 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Happy Monday. We're going to be doing React. React is a lot of really cool stuff that we're going to be learning, and we're going to be starting off with some slides as well as a command. To do this, since we're going to be using something called Create React App, which sort of makes a boilerplate version of a React app for us, and this process takes a while. So rather than shifting from activity to activity, and each one of our activities has everything we need in it, when we look at this, instead we're going to largely see these source folders. And these source folders we're going to copy into our React project over and over again, just to prevent that. Now I'm going to post in class activities. This is both going to have the link for the slides that we're going to be using to intro topics this morning. And it tells us the command that we're running here. I'm inside of 1901 class activities. And from in here, I'm going to run npx create react app. npx create react app, and then I'm going to say practice app. What this is going to do is it's going to make a file or a folder down here at the bottom called practice app. And this is going to have my React in it. Now, this takes a while to run. In fact, it runs quite a bit longer than your typical npm install will at this point. So rather than having you wait and have to spend a lot of your activity times reinstalling this app over and over again, because we're still got a lot of content to go through, we're going to just be moving stuff into the source folder and out of the source folder. So if you want to hold on to your work from a previous activity, you can just copy the source folder out into the relevant activity folder. And when you're working on a new piece, you'll just be copying the source folder provided in that activity folder in there. So a little bit of change of procedure this morning from the way we normally do stuff, but it's not that different. We just want to avoid things taking as long as you can see that they are. Now, while that's going on, let's go ahead and talk about React with the slides a little bit. Again, everything you need to do, and you'll have some time to work with this along the way. So let's go ahead and get started. So React is the final really big thing that we're going to be learning today. It's a front-end framework, and it's probably the most in-demand front-end framework. It's right up there with Angular. Last time we looked at it, with the slight nod being given to React. But React is one of the older ones. It actually took first place away from Angular, and Angular does a lot more. There's way more to Angular. In fact, it'd be much harder to learn Angular at the same time. React is a lot more approachable of this class of things, which is why it's the one of these type that we're going to learn. There's other ones out there like Vue and Svelte, but they're not in the top lists as much as React is. So React, and once you learn React, it's easier to learn the others. We're going to be learning these powerful Vue client-side frameworks, and React is kind of the king of those. So just about every popular UI library that came from React borrows from it. It's one of the originals. I think it first came out in 2013, and it's done a lot since then. And libraries are like fads. They come and go, but the ideas introduced by React appear to be here to stay. They've lasted quite a bit. If you think about how long jQuery's been around and how it's still relevant to what's going on, you kind of get some of the idea of staying power of React. But as everything happens, there's always going to be new JavaScript frameworks. There's always going to be something new for you to learn. The important thing is to more learn the concepts, and then that means that as those concepts reappear in other libraries, or if you work on a new project where they've got something else new, then the spin up time, the adaptation time for you to learn one of them goes down a lot. So even if you end up trying to apply somewhere that does Angular or Ember or Vue, you're going to see a lot of the ideas that we introduce here in React transfer so that if you want to learn those other ones afterwards, you can. And if you're going to pick another one to learn besides React after the bootcamp, statistically, Angular is probably your best shot. But there's a ton of documentation and tutorials on that. We're just going to be focused on React. So let's talk about what React is. React is an open source JavaScript library developed by Facebook for developing UIs, and you'll see kind of that Facebook developed it for them, and then as they thought, hey, other people might be able to use this, and then they open sourced it so a bunch of other people can use it as well. So it's designed to build large apps with rapidly changing data. If you think what's going on with Facebook, it's got this constant feed of activity and a bunch of people like having reactions to things, like liking things, hearting things, whatever the different ones are available right now. You've got Facebook Messenger built into it. You've got all your notifications popping up constantly. Facebook itself is a flurry of activity, and that's where React excels in dealing with a lot of rapidly changing pieces of content. So to do this, it employs, rather than having things be separate in different layers like in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it goes more for this component-based UI, where you're thinking about things more as different pieces of a page, like your friends list or your news feed or your profile page. And those are broken into components, and then each one of the components describes what its HTML, JavaScript, and CSS would look like, rather than having them split into the different layers. And we'll see that in a bit. So again, here's Facebook. If you look at it, tons of different opportunities for things to update, change, new data to be in place. And if we were managing this in the old way with jQuery, we'd have a lot of things we need to keep track of in our head. So we'd a lot of different side effects going on, like, oh, the groups page updated. Let me make sure I've got my code set up for that. Oh, I just got a new message from Hannah. I need to make sure I put that in this window right here. This is a lot of challenge for the DOM, because especially with what we've been doing with the DOM is that we've been just saying, hey, I would like to have a huge render function, one big render function that displays everything. And then I'd like to determine what it looks like based off of that. And which is not a bad way to do it. It definitely makes it easier as developers. Or the alternative is to kind of piecemeal it into a bunch of small changes on it. So instead of doing things with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, we want to break pieces into components and then compose it out of components. So we're going to take this employee list and this employee list item, and this is kind of a duplicate piece of content. This is kind of like the partials that we were doing when we were doing server-side rendering, where we could just repeat that aspect over and over again. But that could only give us the HTML. We want to include the JavaScript, the CSS on there as well. So when I click on James King, then we would see, or Julie Taylor, we would see, hey, here's Julie Taylor. She's the VP of marketing. This whole thing appeared about her. If I click on call office, I can get more about her number or maybe times or availabilities. So all the stuff that controls how this behaves is inside that component. It's not, here's the HTML, and then we're going to load in the JavaScript in this other file, which we happen to have named the same thing, especially as our apps get more and more complicated. So the reason we do this is we want to logically decompose a UI into unique parts. We want to address the unique parts, and then those unique parts are reusable, as well as they're specifically targeted on that. So if I'm coming back here and I'm working on the employee contact card, I can be assured that I'm just working on the employee contact card. And then one of my other teammates can be working on this employee list item, for example. So we're working on the same page, but we're really working on different components in the same page. So we're not going to step on each other's toes in that way. This also makes it easier to reuse these parts, and it's easier to test these pieces in isolation, which can in turn help you find bugs and save time. Now, let's go back to the point I was making earlier about how we handle all the changes in this big dynamic environment. Up until now, the jQuery style of changing things for you probably looks a lot more like this, where we have event handlers, and those event handlers just go out there and immediately change the DOM. So what we want to do, we learned a little bit about this last week, is we have this idea of a pure function. And pure functions are easier to reason about because a pure function gives you the same output based off of the same input. We get the same output based off of the same input. And what we want to do is have this state as our input and output our components and what our web page looks like as sort of a pure function of that state. Now, we're going to not 100% get there, but the more we can get there, the easier it is for us to reason about. Rather than with event handlers, there is kind of this passive state. We're just keeping it in our brain, or it's embedded in the DOM. By separating the state out into its own section, it becomes really easy to look at it and reason about it and say, what should we be doing based off of this state? So with React, whenever the application state changes, the DOM is going to update to reflect that. So rather than writing a bunch of event handlers that directly modify the DOM in some way, all of our event handlers modify the state, and then based off of the state, we know how to render it all out. Now, JavaScript is fast, but if we tried to just redraw the whole DOM every time, that would be really slow. This can be a really slow process because there's a lot of stuff involved with drawing out the whole page. There's recalculating the CSS by itself, and then there's just drawing it on the page. Or if we had to reload an image, that can take a while. So if we said like, hey, we need to update the DOM based off of these article comments when the user signs on, a new weather forecast gets updated, there's new articles in our news feed, some message gets sent, that could take a while. So what we do instead to prevent some little work from happening with the DOM is that we have this thing in memory called the virtual DOM. And the virtual DOM is just essentially another JavaScript object that represents what the DOM looks like. So now when any of these events happen, they make changes to the virtual DOM. And then what React does for us, or more specifically what the React DOM library does for us, is it translates this virtual DOM over to this DOM. And it kind of acts this way like a surgeon, where it looks at what's the minimal amount that I can modify the DOM so that it looks like the virtual DOM. What's the minimal amount I can change the DOM to look like the virtual DOM? Because that's a lot faster than asking the DOM to just update the whole thing. So we're just trying to take notice of the individual small things that actually changed between the two to make it faster. So that's an important performance thing. Now, some of you might be scratching your head a little bit about that explanation. That's completely fine. The most important thing is to realize that the virtual DOM is just a model that looks like the real DOM. And what we do is this in-memory DOM, let's say that we just added this piece to it. This is the real DOM, and this is like, I don't know, your newsfeed. This is your newsfeed component. And some activity happens, and that gets updated. What it's going to do is it says, oh, look, only this component is different from the real DOM. I'm going to just patch that small component in the resulting DOM. I'm not going to have to re-render all of these other pieces. I'm just going to swap out the piece that changed, even though the in-memory DOM is the result of that. So whenever some parts of the application changes, the virtual DOM gets that change first. It gets compared to what that looks like in the real DOM, and then React patches that for us. So we don't have to worry about any of that process. We just have to worry about saying, hey, with React, this is what it should look like at the end of that. And then React does some performance stuff inside of that to help that with us. So React aims to update with the smallest number of changes based off of the virtual DOM that we made. So let's talk about some pros and cons. Every technology has pros and cons. Let's discuss React's. So React has a lot of reusable components. In fact, if you're developing it well, you'll often see people have component libraries, which is just common components that they use from project to project. Especially if you're a company that has multiple websites, but you want to have a strong cohesive brand, you can kind of use components to help you make those websites feel similar in a lot of regards. The UI updates in response to state changes rather than just some event happened. It's something is different about the state, and so that reduces the amount of DOM manipulation code that we need to write. On occasion, you'll still run into stuff. You can build applications on web server and native applications. There's something called React Native, which makes the code that you're writing for React, instead of having it translate from the virtual DOM to the actual DOM, you can have it translate from the virtual DOM to a phone. Now, there's a lot of complications because you're still working with a phone and not a website underneath all of that, but that's possible. And React is probably the easiest to learn of its caliber of library. Is it going to be more difficult than jQuery? Yes. Does it do a lot more than jQuery? Also yes. Now, some of the cons. React is just a view library, which means it's only concerned with manipulating the DOM to make it look like you want. Other libraries like Angular or Ember or Vue include other things like, hey, we're going to help you manage your state, or hold on to help you make requests and cache the results as well. So they can do more for you. There's more of a batteries included approach to that. So in order to, if you want to mimic fully what they're doing there, you have to incorporate other libraries to accomplish those things, like HTTP requests. Fortunately, React has a bunch of those. And in fact, there's a lot of sort of starter packs to get you going with that, but you don't have to, it's not in there. And often React requires a little bit more configuration than other libraries. Another thing is, if you're working with a really simple website and your website doesn't change, there's still nothing wrong with doing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If your page is just like, yeah, it's here, it looks pretty, you can still have a lot of valuable work that gets done without bringing in a very heavy framework like this. React really shines when you have a lot of data that is changing, a website with a lot of activity on it. If your website is largely what I might call a poster or a business card website, where you're just presenting some static pieces of information and there's not a lot of data flowing the application, React can feel like overkill. In that case, there's still some benefits to it, like the component-based approach, so if you want to reuse components, but sometimes it can feel like you're doing too much if that's your goal. So that's just another con potentially in there. But at the end of the day, we teach it for a reason, and you'll feel like React is pretty magical by the end of it. You can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. Now, if you remember last week, we had Webpack, where Webpack is being used here. We're not going to configure it ourselves. We're not going to be touching Webpack, but underneath the hood, we're going to be using Webpack to help us a lot, because we're going to be programming stuff in JSX, and the browser doesn't understand JSX, so we need some way of translating it, and we want that process to happen automatically. The automation part is handled by Webpack, and the translation part is handled by Babel, where Babel takes that JSX and translates it back into earlier versions so that different older browsers can still use all the cool stuff that we've learned. And so that we can target older browsers while still not having to write stuff in the old style, which is nice. Now you might ask, can I just use a CDN rather than setting all of this up? And technically you could, but no one does. And it'd be super slow if you tried. So we're not going to be just linking React in the CDN. React is much more integral to the process than that. So what we did with the Create React app thing that I just showed you is that we sort of got ourselves a startup for all of that. You can see that I kind of finished in here, and I did cd practice app, and then it tells you to say yarn start. Whenever you see yarn start, you can just type npm start if you want. If you don't have yarn installed, Yarn is just a different, it still works with the NPM package registry. It's just a different program that does that. So now, if I typed npm start, it's starting the development server. It's getting booted here, and my computer's doing a bunch of stuff besides just running the website, like recording everything, transmitting everything, etc. And so if I've done everything correctly, I'll see something like this. That's sort of your test to see if that works. So you'll just run the instructions there, and then you can just Control C in here, and then you'll be able to stop once that happens. Now, in order to get a little bit more familiar with React right off the bat, we want you to take some time to read the documentation. And we want you to look at some of the following questions. So the instructions, again, detail what you want to create. I'm suggesting that you do that inside of your activities folder. So your practice app is just right down here beneath all of your activities. We'll be moving stuff into and out of it. So, and then while you're doing that, we've linked to the React documentation. We specifically are asking some questions about Create React App. What are some of the benefits of using React.js? You can use both the things we talked about in class, as well as the answers you find here. Talking about what is a React component, what is the significance of the React DOM.render method, what is JSX, etc., etc., etc. Cool. We're going to open up the breakout rooms at this point, and then we'll discuss this a little bit later. We're going to take the next 15 minutes to work on these questions, and then we'll review all of that. After that, we'll go ahead and demo the React app just so you can, and sort of dive through some of what it creates for us as well. So if you have any questions, let us know. We're opening up the breakout rooms. Good luck. Alrighty, folks. Everyone's still piling back in. Hopefully you're able to answer some of the questions or to get the Create React app installed correctly. We'll be running through and looking at that in just a second. If you had trouble with that, please let us know. We'll have a TA help you out in terms of getting all of that set up. Cool. So looks like most people are back here, so let's start diving into the questions. So let's start with question 1. In the previous section, we executed Create React App. What is it for? And we'll go ahead and keep doing the popcorn method. So I'll get to choose folks at random. So let's choose someone at random. Walter Eccles, you're lucky number next. What is Create React App for?
I don't have an answer. I wasn't able to get to that part.
Okay, go ahead and pick someone to answer to help you out with that.
How about Omar?
Oh, Omar, go ahead.
So some of the benefits were that it's declarative, component-based, and it can be, a lot of the parts of it can be transferred or used with like objects like Node have we been using.
Right. That's good for React, but we're looking specifically at Create React App, which is different.
Sorry, the first question.
No worries.
Yeah. It's just used to create the application folder with the React files basically loaded inside.
For sure. And you got number 2 for us for free. Excellent. So yeah, it's also useful for some of the benefits that Omar listed. It's component based. Some other nice things about it is compared to other frameworks of its type, it's fast to learn, and those concepts get used on a lot of other places. So Omar, go ahead and pick someone to answer question 3 for us.
Gotcha. I see Aldo.
All right, Aldo, question 3, what is a React component?
Is it asking for like a specific example of a component?
Well, it's just asking what a React component is. Like if you were to describe what a React component is, what is it?
Not actually sure.
All right, go ahead and pick someone.
I see Joyce on my screen.
All right, Joyce, what is a React component?
They're like JavaScript functions, so they're accepting the inputs, which in React are called props, and then they're returning the React elements and describing what is supposed to appear on the screen.
Yeah, excellent. They're these, a lot of times functions. They can, and we'll see functional components. There's other types of components, but a lot of times, especially modern JavaScript, they're functions. And they're returning these elements, which is like these JSX elements, or which are other components, which ultimately boil down to the elements you and I are familiar with, like divs, images, etc. Excellent answer. Let's go ahead and go on to the question number 4. So Joyce, go ahead and pick someone else to answer. What is the significance of the React DOM.render method?
I see Andy.
All right, Andy, let's answer question number 4.
So is it what renders like what you want to put into like a specific element?
So there is the render function per component, but that's a little bit different than the React DOM.render.
Okay.
But good guess. React DOM.render is what takes our virtual DOM and renders it onto the actual DOM. So it's that process. When we look at render within each individual component, that's building up the virtual DOM, and then React DOM.render is what transfers it over. So close. And they're both named the same thing, which can get confusing sometimes. Nevertheless, good work. Let's go ahead and have you pick someone to answer number 5, what is JSX? And why does Facebook recommend using it?
I see Daniel.
All right, Daniel, question number 5.
JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript,
Mhm.
and they recommend using it to describe what the UI should look like.
Right. They recommend using it to do that. And the reason is, well, you can write React without JSX. Almost nobody does, but you can, because it's a lot more verbose, it's a lot more wordy, it's a lot harder to read. So JSX makes it easier to sort of read or realize what the function or what the components are doing and what's going on. Cool. Daniel, go ahead and pick someone for question number 7. What is Babel and what role does it play?
I see Marissa.
Marissa, question 7.
I didn't get this far, but if I remember correctly, I think Babel translate our language for the web server, was it something like that?
Yeah. So it takes our JSX, which the browser doesn't understand by default, and it turns it into JavaScript that the browser does understand. So we can write stuff in this more expressive format and still be making a website for our browser. So Babel is what's known as a transpiler. And the reason it does that is because it's translating it from one language or format, as it were, into another language or format. And so you'll often hear it called the Babel transpiler. Sometimes you'll hear it called a compiler. But that's what people are doing there. Now, thank you, Marissa. Go ahead and pick someone to answer question 8 for us. What is the significance of the curly braces in JSX?
I see Matt Moline.
All right, Matt. Matt Moline, talk to us about question 8.
Basically, that's just where you put like the like your components, your JSX components, right? Or your at least like your valid JavaScript expressions. You can put basically anything in there.
Yeah, it's kind of like when we use $, curly braces in template strings. It just allows us to get back into regular JavaScript and not in the JSX, which looks a little bit more like the HTML sections of JavaScript or of JSX. So it's a lot like interpreting, or a lot like the $ curly braces of template strings. And that it's, hey, this is where we're going to evaluate JavaScript. And we'll see that more as we go through some different examples. So yes, great answer. All right, Matt, go ahead and pick someone to answer number 9 for us. What is a component prop?
I see Jordan.
All right, Jordan. Number 9, what is a component prop?
So a component prop is kind of like in a key value pair. It's something we assign to something we assign to the component, which can be passed into the render functions that we use.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, it's a value that we pass from outside of the component that the component uses. So yes. And oftentimes props is one big object with a bunch of key value pairs, and each one of those is an individual prop. So awesome. Good job, everyone. So we're going to next take a look at what we get from the default Create React App application by scrolling down here and looking at the practice app. So this is all the client-side application. No server-side code in here, but we see node modules. But we saw with Webpack, for example, that we could use front end, or we could use node modules in our front ends by bundling all of that together. Source is very much like the source that we had from Webpack, where it is going to use each one of these pieces. We'll talk about them in a bit more. We've got our package.json, which includes all of the things that we use. It's got some extra pieces you might not be used to seeing, like these different testing libraries, as well as some of these browser lists. These browser list pieces are more to do for Webpack. For, hey, we're targeting browsers that have more than 0.2% of the market share. They're not dead, and we kind of have written off Opera Mini entirely, even though it's out there. For development, They just want to target whatever the last one versions of Chrome, Firefox, and Safari were. So these are different browser lists to support the transpiling going on. And then our different scripts, which are basically just passing it off to React scripts. Important thing, you don't really want to run eject as part of this course. Sure, it's a script you could run. I recommend not running it because chances are you don't need to for this course. But it sort of opens everything up so that you can customize it. Like you'll see your webpack.config.js and all of these other things. But it is more than you need to look at this point. There's a README here, tells you a little bit about how to do it. Whenever it says yarn start or yarn test, you can say npm run start, npm run test, npm run build, etc. And it'll do all of that stuff. So let's go ahead and say npm run start. And we can see it runs React script starts, which is going to actually start up a web server which serves our client application. This can help us a lot because we get each of the items here. And a nice thing about it is that this will actually reload the page whenever I make a change to it. So without me having to refresh it. So if I come into source, into app.js, and I change this period to like 3 exclamation marks in a row and I click save. If I come back here without me hitting anything, once it's saved and updated, it's going to just update the page. So nice thing going on there on localhost 3000 for us. Whenever we make a change, it'll auto update. We don't have to refresh out anything. It'll just refresh the page for us.
So I got an error, and I'm sure a few other people have it also.
I got an arrow too.
Yeah, the requires, or there may be a problem with your project dependency tree. So the project requires 4.42, but we had loaded in 4.44.1 at some point.
Interesting.
For Webpack, yeah.
And so your package.json, what version of Create React App are you using? Or do you know what version it was? Let me look.
I don't know. I just ran the.
Yeah, that should have gotten you to this point then.
Yeah, like got everything in, and then when I run the start, it throws that error.
Try running npm install and then running npm start after that and see what that does for you.
Yeah, I deleted the package.lock because it says, it gives you some instructions. Like create or deleted the package.lock and the node modules and then reran npm install, and it still gave the same.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to post my package.json in class activities. So try
updating.
Yeah, try changing it to that and then running npm install again at that point. And we'll have an opportunity for y'all to use that. So try replacing your package.json with that. And if it doesn't work, we'll figure that one out. Now, while we're working on that, while we're rerunning npm install and getting all the necessary pieces, let's look at some of the other things that are here. So we've got public here. This is index.html. It's got our logos. It's got a manifest already built for us. There's even some service workers. You'll notice in the source, the service workers are there if we want to turn it on for being a PWA. We're not going to at this point. It's got a robots.txt. The robots.txt is to help with search engine stuff. And then we've got a favicon, which is just the React logo. So a lot of this stuff is just PWA centric. But the real meat of our application is in source. So we know that looking at a folder, one of the first things you want to look at is there an index.js? We see one here. And you'll see that we have one piece right here. So we've got React DOM.render, and then it has React.strict mode. But the more important thing here is app. This is the virtual DOM, and this is the method that renders or takes the virtual DOM and puts it on the page. You'll notice inside of public index.html, there's not much here except for a div with an ID of root. In our index.js here, we're looking for that element root, and we're passing it to the render function, and that means, hey, render your whole app inside of this piece. Most of the time, your React app is going to take up everything. It's going to be your whole app, but there's some other stuff that you can do. This is service worker.unregister, which just says, hey, service worker, go ahead and unregister yourself. You can comment that out. If you want your app to work offline and load faster, you can change this to say register instead of unregister. But that comes with some pitfalls, some of the other development stuff that we saw when we were working with PWAs last week. Now, let's move into app.js. So app.js is a function. You'll notice we have these import styles. These are basically like using require. We're importing the React library, but we're also importing this SVG. This SVG is just something that kind of looks like HTML. We can just put it on the page somewhere. We're importing this CSS, which means that when you put this on the page, you can just use CSS like you normally would here. You'll notice there's a lot of different classes and media queries and some keyframes even from different animations. But let's look at this function. This function takes in props, in this case not any in particular because it's the top level one, and it returns us JSX. So it says return open parenthesis, close parenthesis, and this looks like HTML. This almost looks like we just forgot to include the backticks around templates, but it's got syntax highlighting and a few other things. Our image, our source is that logo that we imported earlier. All of this kind of just looks like HTML with a few exceptions. One of the exceptions, class name. Since JSX is still ultimately more JavaScript than class, or JavaScript than HTML. And so we can't use class because we know that class is a keyword in JavaScript. And so we have to choose something else. So you use class name. If you try and mark it as class, you'll get a warning. But it looks inside of our source folder, looks for an index.js, looks for an app.js, it loads in the CSS and other things, and then it can go from there. Now, we've got a few other files in here, like setup tests and app.test.js. Those have to do with testing with React. We're not going to get into those a ton, but it's worth knowing. Now, when you copy your source folder, or what we're going to be doing for each one of these is we're going to see how we have an unsolved folder labeled source right here. We're going to you can either rename your source folder or delete your source folder. I'm going to be deleting mine. And then copying that into there. Now, if you're on a Mac, you're lucky because you're not going to have to restart your web server as much versus on Windows. Pretty much what you'll want to do is you'll have to do npm run start again after you copy it over each time. So if we look in here, I've reduced this quite a bit, and it'll refresh there in just a second. My index.js has been reduced down to just React DOM.render app, and I'm not including my logo, I'm not including the CSS, other things like that. And inside of app.js, pardon?
Can we go over what happened with the source folder just one more time? Because I don't think I absorbed that and it seems very important.
Yeah, you're just copying this.
Okay.
And replacing the source folder that was inside your practice app.
Thank you.
So you're just replacing a folder.
Thank you so much.
And then you'll see that we have returned hello React. So this is where it's a little bit different. Hello React is another function, and it returns hello world. So now we can see we can make our own components that are small. This is how we can bundle together different parts of the UI, is by just having these different sections on there. So what we're going to do is take some time. We're going to make sure everyone's getting set up properly with React. And we want you to copy over your source folder, and you'll know it works correctly. You've done everything correctly if it just says hello world right here on localhost 3000 after you run npm run start. So we're going to make sure everyone can get to this point, make sure that we're handling any issues that might be running up for anybody. So if you're running into issues, let us know. If we're seeing a lot of the same issues, we might bring everyone back and address it in a group, but we just want you to get to this point where you can see hello world on the screen. So we're going to open up the breakout rooms. Let us know if of any issues you're running into. Good luck. All right, folks. Hopefully most of y'all were able to get to that point at this point. So again, how you would do that is, let's just go through the steps again. Inside of activities, practice app, we delete the existing source folder, and then we make sure to copy in the whole source folder here. So what I do is I open up, let's do hello React, unsolved, copy the source folder, and then you should paste the whole source folder right there. So if that's something we'll be doing throughout all of these activities. Once that's done, you want to make sure that you've stopped your web server and you've restarted it, and then you should be able to visit localhost 3000 and see your app once it's started up. And then you might need to refresh it a couple times because sometimes it takes a little bit to start up the development server. There it is. Now let's review by looking at some of the different pieces before we have y'all work on some of this yourself. This is kind of a stripped down version of the source folder because there's not much to it. Inside of index.js, we don't have the service worker reference. We're not particularly worried about the service worker at this point. You can enable it if you want. We just want to render out our app to the root. Remember, inside of our public folder is the index.html. In here is where Webpack will dump the bundle file that is being used by React. Now, you don't need to mention that here. That'll automatically get taken care of by the application. So you don't need to change anything here. That's just to help you see how everything's pieced together. So we've got index.html, which is where we see this root element, which is where inside of index.js, we find that root element, and then we put the virtual DOM into the actual DOM. Inside of app.js, we have a React component. This is a functional component in that it just takes any props, in this case none, and then returns some JSX as a response. Now the JSX, as it turns out, is another component. And the component is similarly another functional component. And so this time we render out hello React, where we're using the angle brackets, where we can just treat it like a normal HTML element. Great way to tell them apart. You should always have components that are uppercase, start uppercase, versus stuff that's all lowercase or just looks like regular HTML elements you'll see on the page. And so we render out the whole hello world. And if we make changes here and save it, it'll recompile it, it'll rebuild everything for us. And now hello world has those extra exclamation points. Now, we're going to give you a chance to practice with some of this. So what we want you to do is open up, or is to copy over 05, or not, sorry, 05, 03, student hello div. You're going to be copying over the unsolved version. I'm going to be copying over the solved version. And make sure that you're working within the practice app copy of your folder. Sometimes you can forget and get rid of it. If you want to hold on to the work that you did there, what I would recommend is renaming the source folder here instead of deleting it to be like source_activity 01 or something like that, instead of just deleting it. But I'm going to just be deleting it to make room for the next one, and then restarting my web server. So you'll notice inside of this one, we've got, and it should have an index.js in it. And it doesn't for some reason. We'll just copy that one over. For some reason, it's missing in that one. They're all pretty much the same. Copy that one. Restart that. And our index.js is just the same as it ever was. Now, what is it not like? Practice app source. The source has an index.js in it now. Let's try that again. Oh, I copied it into the public folder. Ha. Let's move that into its correct place. Got to make sure you mimic the folder structure exactly, otherwise React gets confused. Cool, so now it's started up. And what you're going to be doing in this case is you're going to see the following. Hey guys, I'm a header, and then some things that you like. So you're just going to be putting in regular HTML. The README for this describes the following. It says how to copy everything over. And what we want you to do is reference the hello-div.js code if you want. We want you to add in a heading tag introducing yourself. Hello, my name is whatever your name happens to be. And then put in an unordered list of at least 3 things you like. Now, to do this, you'll need to import the React library. You can reference the previous Hello React activity, how to do that, because what you start out with is this. Hello div return null. You're going to need to add more than just stuff to the return statement, but of course you'll need to change that as well. I recommend looking at O2 and looking at the Hello React component right here as reference to kind of get started with that. If you have any questions, let us know. If you're still running into issues getting your React project working, let us know. Otherwise, we're going to be working on this for the next 10 minutes. Good luck. Alrighty, folks. Just got a few things we gotta do here to get through this. If you're still running into issues, let us know. A lot of what we're doing today is making sure everyone's set up and understands the process. We don't want to run into too many issues here. Now, to help us with this, I'm going to look at the previous example we had, which was if we looked at hello react.js, and let's sort of put the two side by side. So our task from the README was we wanted to put in a header and different things that I like. So let's start me out. What should I do first?
Import React.
All right, let's import React. Whenever we use JSX, we need to import React because it's actually being used behind the scenes. So we're going to import React. That's something you're going to see at the top of every component. Every component. What else?
Instead of null, return. Does it need to be in parentheses if you're going to have like multiple lines?
If you're going to have multiple lines, yeah. Or at least there needs to be something at the beginning here. It just can't be returned by itself is the big thing. So we could return, if you want parentheses, that can help you out.
And then a div.
And then a div. I'm actually going to get around that first. So let's do it without a div first and see what happens, as some of you might have run into. So let's just put an H1, and then we'll get back to the div. And let's say, hello, my name is Eric. Come back to the page. Fantastic. And I capitalized everything for some reason. All right. Cool. That's fine. And then if I put a P tag or a UL tag, let's say, and then some LI, like, what's some of the stuff I like?
Hot dogs.
I've got a reputation. Hot dogs.
Avatar: The Last Airbender.
I do like Avatar: The Last Airbender. And one more thing.
Saying what about a bing bong?
It's a good word. It's a good word because you're not likely to confuse it for everything else. Seems pretty good to me. Now, we might even notice there's a little bit of Visual Studio Code might highlight some errors, and where it says JS expression must have one parent element, but let's assume we don't see that. When we save it, We'll see that same error here. Adjacent JSX elements must wrapped in an enclosing tag. Did you want a JSS fragment? And then let's refresh it here, and then it says that same error. So we've got it in 3 different locations, probably important. When we're returning an element like this, we want it to kind of feel like an element, which means it has to have one parent enclosing tags. Now, one way that they suggest doing that here is a fragment. You can also return it as an array. The way that you're going to see us do it a lot of the time is that we're going to put a div around it, like so. That way it kind of retains, it feels like a single element. So now those errors are gone.
Is
and
that
we see this
standard?
right here. That's
for,
pretty
like,
standard.
industry? Okay.
Yeah. Another thing you can do is you can just make it a fragment by getting rid of anything in there like div, and then it'll literally put that on the page. So instead of this being a div, it'll just do, if we look in the inspector, and we look at the elements here, once it finishes loading, you'll notice it just puts one after the other. And so you can use a JSX fragment, which is like tags without div written in them, essentially. And that way it'll put it on its own line, versus if you put it in a div, which is another very common industry thing to do, it'll embed that in a div. So you can either use a fragment, which is basically a tag with no label, or you can use a div. And both of those are fine. You can technically also return an array, but it's better to use one of these other 2 methods. Either is fine. You'll see me use both.
Do you have to, so mine worked perfectly fine without the parentheses. Do you have to use
you don't have to have the parentheses. You just can't have return on a line by itself. So if you did something like this.
Got it. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
That's fine too.
Oh, thank you.
So either way, cool. So important thing whenever you're working with functional components, make sure that you're returning one parent element, whether that's the JSX fragment symbol or a div or some other container like a p tag or something. You need to have one top level component, and then you need to import React. Big 2 things whenever you're making functional components or components in general. Cool. Let's move on to the next section. So the neat thing about this is we can also include Bootstrap in this. So if I've got index.js, app.js, and then hello Bootstrap, you'll notice right here I'm using a bunch of Bootstrap classes. Now, if I copy over the source for this, unfortunately, I'm not loading in Bootstrap yet. So I'm going to copy this, and we'll go over to my practice app. I'm going to delete my old source. And pop that in there. Now, as it restarted, unfortunately, like all of that stuff isn't there. Now, the JavaScript portion of Bootstrap stuff is not going to be necessarily very compatible with what we're doing. jQuery and React don't mix super well. So, but I can still do the CSS portion of it without too much trouble. So I'm going to click this CSS, and what I'm going to do is copy this CSS into my index.html, just up at the top. So I'm including my CSS just like I normally would. I'm just putting it inside of my public folder in the index.html, so just like you would do here. Now, if I come back and I refresh the page, it's using those CSS components. So that's something that we'd want to be able to do, just the ability to incorporate Bootstrap like this and have all of those work. So the Bootstrap source file, if you look at our components here, hello Bootstrap, you'll notice that the only big difference is that everything says class name instead of class. we're still using all those Bootstrap components that we had before. So all of those are still set up. You can still copy examples from like bootstrap.com or something like that. You'll just need to put class name instead of class, and you'll need to copy over some of that other stuff. Now, as it turns out, if you actually want to use full Bootstrap in here, there is a React Bootstrap module out there. And what this does is it actually lets you have components that are a Jumbotron or links that map with some of these different pieces. So here's like an alert, and you can see that we've got an alert component with a variant called success. We're not doing this quite yet. If you want to use this for project 3, you should, but we're not going to use that as part of the lessons, but that's how you would actually use the versions of Bootstrap that have like some JavaScript interactivity to them. Then you would probably opt to instead use React Bootstrap for now. But for now, the big thing that we want you to get used to is, hey, this is how you can incorporate style sheets from other places.
And did you put that in your head just like you would in the index?
Inside of public index.html, you just link it like you would anything else. So it's just in the head right here.
Yeah.
Now, you might need to restart your web server.
Oh, good
but and after that, it should be there. And then copy over your Bootstrap components and stuff like that. Now, what we want you to do is something similar to that. We want you to incorporate all of that into here. So if we look at the README, we've actually included a link to Bootstrap right there ready for you. And we want you to get started with the unsolved version. You should see a Bootstrap navbar, a Bootstrap Jumbotron, a Bootstrap card, or you should do that once you're done. So let's copy that over so we can see the different pieces. So we're going to copy over the basic version, and then we'll look at the bonus version later. So at a very basic level, what you'll want to see is the following. Something that looks like this. You've got a nav bar. The nav bar isn't doing anything. That's fine. That's not what we're worried about. We're just worried about the beginning style, a Jumbotron, and a card beneath it. Now, you can look at some extra stuff that you could potentially do in the bonus, which will actually look pretty similarly. But if you finish early, you can look at actually moving those into their own components and stuff like that. So we're going to work on this basically until, or all the way up until lunch. After lunch, we'll review it and then move forward. So we're going to open up the breakout rooms at this point. If you're having issues still, let us know. We want to make sure that by the end of this morning, everyone's kind of set up fully ready to go. And if you have questions about what we're covering now, just let us know. We'd also be happy to answer anything around that. Good luck. Alrighty, folks. Hopefully you had a pretty good lunch. We're going to get started here in just a little bit. We got about half the class, the usual get back from class, make sure everyone gets back here, get started. But when we do, we're going to look at or pick up where we left off, where we're talking about Bootstrap a little bit and how we can incorporate it. And we're going to start looking at how we can reuse different pieces a lot. We're going to look at how we can just break stuff into different components to sort of control the level at which we componentize things. And we'll even see how we can replace some of the contents of those and have different information flow into them. It promises to be pretty cool. So let's go ahead and go through the activity that we had before. So I'm going to copy over the unsolved version of it into my practice app. Get rid of that and pop it right back in there so that we're good to go. The thing that we were asked to do to start out with was create a component and then load in all of our different pieces. So we wanted to have a container, we wanted to have a nav bar, we wanted to have a card, we wanted to have a jumbotron. Let's add all of those different pieces in there. So app.js, render bootstrap components here. So oftentimes for things that aren't necessarily at a page level, we'll make a folder called components. And inside of that component, I'm just going to put hello bootstrap.js. The file is the same as the name of the component that it houses. So from here, we're going to need to, what I often do is I just say function, hello bootstrap. Currently it doesn't take any props. We'll be altering that later today. And then we say this returns, I'm just going to say div bootstrap component goes here. And then, of course, I want to export it. Module or export default, not module.exports, because we're using ES6 style modules. Hello bootstrap, and then up at the top, we of course need to remember to import React from React. Cool. Now, in order to use this in app.js, I need to import it. So I'm going to import hello bootstrap from, and then I'll need to provide the relative path to it. So ./components/hello bootstrap. And then, since this is my only thing here, I'm just going to render and say, all right, hello bootstrap, like so. Now, if you're just rendering this component by itself, you can actually make it a self-closing component by putting a slash at the end. And that way it treats it kind of like we do with image tags, where it's just this thing. There's no content that we're putting in between it. Later, we'll learn how we can do that, but we don't need it for right now. So let's go ahead and actually fill the rest of this in. So here's our div. And all I'm going to do from this point is go over to the Bootstrap site and copy over a nav bar. So we'll go ahead and open up bootstrap.com or get bootstrap. Get started. And we'll go over to components. Let's go grab a nav. Find one that we like. Let's see, what about nav bar? This one seems fine. So we'll go ahead and grab this. We'll put it there. I'll get a Jumbotron, and I'll get a card. And then we also have to fix up this a little bit. So one of those things is going to be a slash. We'll fix that because we need to format the document. And then we'll grab a card as our final one. Cool. So, sometimes just straight copying it over, there's going to be some issues. So if I go to localhost 3000, you'll notice that it has a couple of different errors on it. And so this is a great way to tour some of the gotchas that you can get when you're copying stuff over. So first of all, and we'll see this later, you can't set the style property like this. You can't set the style property like this. Now, that's happening on line 17 here. So you'll notice that it says style width is 18 rem. I'm kind of glossing over this right now, but if we set it like this, that'll fix that issue. If we come back here, refresh the page, a lot of it's fixed. Now, we're going to get a lot of errors here where it says, did you mean class name, wherever we said class? So let's go through and fix that real quick. So we use class a lot here. So unfortunately, it can be kind of hard to do that, but we're going to replace that with class name, and we'll do that there. Oh, we did it one too many times there. We'll just undo some stuff here. Or we'll just manually do it as it'll be easier. We'll fix that, fix that, fix that, fix that. Etc. etc. So now we shouldn't receive that error anymore. So just a review of some of the gotchas. JSX doesn't like self-closing elements without a slash at the end, so you need to make sure that you include a slash like that. An example of that is the HR that we set up right here. We had to add a closing slash at the end. Another thing is that we need to change class name to Jumbotron. And another one is we can't set the style attribute directly the way that we're used to with strings. We'll see that we can do it with objects, and we'll decode what we mean by this a little bit later, but that's just kind of as a gotcha. If you're worried about it, you could also just pull that off. Now, this is cool, but this is kind of hard-coded to be this specific example. So what I'm going to do is actually break this up into different pieces. So I'm going to say I have a new file, and I'm going to make a navbar component. So navbar.js. And so then I'm going to copy paste this into here. So import, get rid of that for now. Import React from React, function navbar, return this, and we'll make sure it's formatted nicely. And then we'll say export default navbar. And now we can come over here and we can import it. Navbar from /navbar. And then we can just put our navbar here. And because we're not passing anything to it, we can use a slash at the end. You could do it the other way as well, where you have an open and close nav bar like so, but we're not putting anything in there as content yet. We'll look at that later. So we can do it like this. In fact, we can do this for all of them. So I'm going to copy this one, rename this to be Jumbotron. And of course, replace the contents of it. Put in the Jumbotron, make sure that we import it as well, and then do the same thing for the card. So we'll copy the navbar one more time, rename it to be card.js, and of course, change the names so that they match correctly. We'll go over to Bootstrap, or Hello Bootstrap. We'll copy this in here. Format the document, then come back here and say, I would like to include a card, making sure that we've imported all of our relevant libraries. And this kind of practice is super common. Now I say, what's Hello Bootstrap? Well, it's a combination of the navbar, a Jumbotron, and then a card beneath it. And the neat thing is, if I want to reuse the card anywhere, I can. Later, we'll see how we can actually change the contents of the card depending on what we pass into it, so we have a very reusable template to work with. But already, this also makes it much easier if we're all working on the same page. We're now not all working in the same file. It looks all the same. So if me, Larkin, and Christian are all working on a project together, I can be working on the navbar. Larkin can be working on the Jumbotron, and Christian can be working on the card, and we're not overriding the same files. We're just working on these different pieces. So there's already huge benefit just from that, which is pretty cool.
Do you mind popping into your app.js folder?
Sure, that just renders out Hello Bootstrap.
Yeah.
Eric, can you go over again on line 7, the default part? What if you leave it out, will it still work?
Yes, but you'll have to import it differently. So if you want to export a bunch of stuff, you can export those, but then you have to say exactly what you're importing. Versus the default lets us do it like this. So if I dropped the default from navbar, like so, inside of Hello Jumbotron, I'd have to import it like this. So you can still export without the default, it just changes how you import it somewhere else. And that has to do when you're exporting multiple things from the same file. So since we're just exporting one thing, we export it as the default. And that's pretty common. So you'll see either a combination of people exporting multiple things or exporting one thing as the default a lot of the time. But to answer your original question, yes, you can do it without the default. You just have to change your imports to match.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Other questions?
Is there a reason why there's a space after the navbar, Jumbotron, and card before that /?
Say it again, sorry.
Is there a reason why there's a space between the navbar, Jumbotron, card, and then the /?
Because I like it there.
Fair.
Like that works. I just like to have an extra spot there because it makes it easy for me if I want to go back in and put props to click there. That's a personal preference thing. If you didn't have that, that's completely fine. And you could also have written it out like this if you did the bonus, and it would work fine. This is just more succinct because we're not passing anything to it. We're not adding any content for it to work. Cool. All right. Cool. So let's look at our next piece here. So what we want to look at next is JSX variables. And what JSX variables or expressions let us do is, instead of just hard coding exactly what's in here, we can put an expression in there. So for example, if I wanted like a random number, if I wanted to calculate something, I could. Now we're going to start out pretty simple, just learning how to embed very simple expressions, but it feels a lot like template strings. So I imagine it should be intuitive to those of you who have done a lot with template strings at this point. So let's go over to 06, instructor JSS variables. You can join with me in doing this, or you can just follow along. So let's go ahead, get rid of our old source folder. Oh no, it's all gone. We'll paste a new one into there. Let's see. So now, here we are. My name is Ahmed, but you can call me the JSX boss. I hear it in the same way that people say cake boss. I can do math, obviously, by showing you the number 3, I can do math. I can generate random numbers, 6, 6, and 3. I can even reverse my name. And so I can refresh the page, and actually you'll see that we're getting a random set of numbers each time, which is kind of cool. So let's look at how this happens. Now, to us, if we look at the HTML, like it doesn't look like, if you look in here, it doesn't look special, just looks like a series of HTML statements, much like you would if you were modifying it with jQuery. But let's take a look at how that works. And let's play around with it a little bit. So if we look inside the source and we look inside of app.js, you always start at index.js, but 90% of the time it looks exactly like this. So I usually just skip to app.js, and we see that we're rendering out the JSX variables component. Inside of the JSX variables component, we are returning some stuff. Now, you'll notice we've got something new. A, we're declaring variables, and B, we've got these open close parentheses that we saw we were using with, or I was using with style. Let's dive into that a little bit more. So things between the opening and closing curly brace are where we sort of jump back into JavaScript from the HTML part of JSX. This is where we're jumping back into the JavaScript, as it were. So everything between these we read as regular JavaScript. This is how we get back into the JavaScript once we start sort of doing the HTML of the JSX. It's almost like template strings, except there's no $sign. You don't need a $sign at the beginning. JSX says, why would we need an extra $sign? So it says, my name is Ahmed. And so if I come up here and I change this to be Eric, and I refresh the page, and I come back here, it says, my name is Eric. So it's doing it based off of that property. And then we can say, or do operations like num1 plus num2. We can call functions, etc. We can't do everything. It has to be an expression. For example, we can't do for loops or if statements in here, but you can do function calls. Anything that you could assign or say like var blank equals something, you can do here. So that could be function calls. That could be adding things together. That could be constructing strings. There's a lot. It's not completely freeform, but it's pretty wide open, and we'll look at that some more. So here we can see we're doing some function calls where we're just making 3 random numbers each time, and then you can do other operations like we took our name, we split it into its components, we reversed it, and then we're going to join it back together. So you can see my name got reversed just by benefit of doing that. So this is what you can do with JSX variables. By using the brackets, we can go back to just doing stuff with JavaScript. So let's continue. So we want you to use this information, and you can reference this to do the following activity. I'll show you what the solved version of it looks like. All right, so we'll get rid of source. Copy it back in there. Let's take a look. So this is, hi, my name is Christian. My name has 9 letters. My name without any vowels is Christian. I think React is amazing. So everything in parentheses here, the way we've written it, was done through JSX variables. So that's what we want you to do. You put in your name. You calculate how many letters your name has, and you output it to the page. You calculate what your name is if you don't have any vowels, and how you feel about React at this point. So to start out with, let's look at what you get to begin with. We sort of set up everything, all the components for you. Your job is to fill this space in with JSX expressions. So you're going to be dynamically calculating. So I shouldn't be writing my name is Eric and then just manually figuring these out. These should be expressions like we saw in the last one. So we don't want to see it hard coded. We want to see it's so that you have variables up here like const name equals Eric, and then you're using this variable. And then I think React, and then I would say like const feelings equals is pretty cool. And I would want to put that on the page. If you finish early, you can do the bonus, which is trying to strip out all the vowels from your name, which will be pretty fun. We're going to work on this for, let me look here. For the next 10 minutes. If you have questions, if you're running into issues, let us know. We'd love to help you out. Good luck. Alrighty, folks. Everyone's starting to pour back in. We'll be going over this in just a second. You can see that we've got some stuff with the different variables going on. We've got our strip vowels function, which is always fun. Sometimes I like seeing it called disembowel, but that's me. So let's see. Still waiting for some folks to get back. Oh, there they are. So everyone's kind of popping back in at this point. So let's look at it. So we've got our variables here. Now, a lot of the time, we're not going to have our variables passed in up here. They're going to be passed to us as function arguments, specifically a function argument named props. But it's the same idea. We're just going to change in the future where we're getting them from. They won't be hard coded. Nevertheless, still sometimes you use it. So, hi, my name is name. It sees that this is looking for it. So it looks in its parent scope and it says, I don't have something called name. So it goes and it looks in the parent scope above that and it sees the name Christian, and so it uses it. Same thing with name.length and the strip vowels function in order to take all of those out, and then we just have thoughts. The strip vowels function works by creating a list of vowels and then going through each letter in the alphabet and asking if the array vowels includes the lowercase version of that letter. If it does not do that, then we add that letter to our result. Otherwise, we get rid of it. Something cheeky I always like to do is say if math.random is greater than or equal to 0.5, vowels.push y, but that's not necessary.
So I found a replace function, the name.replace, and then it was like a regex that just had the vowels and replaced it with a empty space.
You can totally do that as well. That would probably look like, I think it's like AEIOU, but it's got like dots next to them and slashes and all that. So yeah, there's regular expressions. If you did it another way than that, that's completely fine as well. This is just a way to do it. There's multiple ways to do it. Cool. Any questions about what we see here so far? All right. So what we're going to see next is different ways that we can incorporate style onto our page, kind of just as a reminder to survey some of them. And one of those ways is using JSX. So we're going to take a look at that in this next piece, which is the instructor CSS demo. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the source over. We're going to get rid of the old one. And take a look at this. So I'm going to have just some differently styled pages here. Home, home, all of these things have different styles, but these things are also different components, and we're going to look at some of the different techniques you can use to style some of this. Some of this we saw right at the beginning. If we look at our source, index.js, and then go to app.js, you'll see that app doesn't have any styles of its own. Nothing relating to style here. Let's take a look at header first of all. So if we look at components and we jump into header, you can see that what we're doing here is we're importing a style. Now what does this do? This takes the styles of header.css and it puts it in the head, which means it applies to the whole document. Now it only happens when header is on the page, but it still applies to the whole document. So let's take a look at that. So if we look here and we look in the head, we'll see that there is a style sheet, or this style right here. Oop. This style element right here. This is the content of header.css. This is what React does when you import style to it. It injects a style tag in the head with the contents of this file. So we see header and h1 right there, just right there in the style. So what this means that if I have other elements with the class header on the page, it'll apply to those as well. So that's one way you can do it. But potentially you're running into issues where you might affect other things accidentally the same way you would with regular styles if you imported a CSS thing on the page. Now, if I don't include header on the page, let's go back to app.js and say, hey, there's no header. Comment it out. If we come back here and we look in the head, It shouldn't be there. Oh, is it still loading? Let's refresh the page because it shouldn't be loading there. Oh, we'd have to comment this one out as well, because once we import header, it'll import the CSS by extension. So let's refresh the page. Scroll down here, and you'll see that that style section is gone because we're no longer importing the header tag, which imports the CSS onto our page. So if we don't import that, it won't exist. So that's our first way of putting styles on the page. Well, technically our second. The first one is just to link a CSS page like we did with Bootstrap. That way still works. You can still just link a style sheet if you want. The other way is to import a style sheet in a component, and React will inject it into the head. The next way I want to look at, and I forget if it's in navbar or card. Let's take a look at navbar. Yes, the next way is a little bit different, and this is called setting a styles object. This is going to be the styles for the card and the styles for the heading, and this is what we saw a little bit ago when we got some of our different, or when we looked at it when we were just introducing components when we were working with Bootstrap. So this is an object, and you'll notice that some of the properties are named differently. For example, min height is actually the CSS property min-height, and line height is the property line-height, and font size is the property, well, font size. But I can't name something just font-size because that's not a valid property name. So JSX, rather than making us put quotes around it, also just lets us get rid of the dash and capitalize the next letter whenever we're using these. But these are just the same CSS properties that you've been modifying since project 1. Same CSS properties. They're just grouped into these objects, one called heading, one called card, and we group all of them together into this big object called styles. You'll notice that on some of these, some of these are numbers, some of these are strings. By default, for many of these, if it's a number, it'll just default to the unit pixels. However, if you aren't sure, you can always make it a string and by default, put the unit on there. So it's margin 20 pixels. Now, for some of these, the unit will change. For example, the line height is going to result, I think, by default resolve to ems. The min height will be pixels, etc. When in doubt, you can always just put it in quotes for the value and then write it out exactly like you would for your CSS. So this sets the styles, but then in the navbar, this is where we actually applied those styles to the element. So this navbar is going to have the styles defined in styles.card. So it's going to have a margin of 20 and a background of this specific color. So if we refresh the page and we take a look at the navbar, you'll see that it has those styles, the margins, and then the background color set, and these different styles. So it translates these into directly setting those properties. And they're just stored here. So now we can apply it to each one of those. There's the style, there's the heading, and we don't have to look at all of it. We just reference it, and we don't have to write it all in line. And we can do that as properties, which means we can do things like this dynamically. An example might be, hey, we have a dark theme and a light theme. And then we can just easily toggle between the two, depend on whether the user wants a light theme or a dark theme. So it makes it really easy to mess with the styles dynamically and still have them apply only to the object that you want. Lastly, let's take a look at the card. The card basically does the same thing as before, or as the navbar does, it just breaks it up into 3 sections instead of 2 and gives each one of them their own style. Now, if you wanted to do it inline, for example, we wanted to do the styles card inline, the first set of curly braces escapes you into JSX, and the second set of curly braces creates an object literal. So I can now say margin 20, because I'm basically just copying what we have up here, and then the background gets set to this, but it's fundamentally doing the same thing. It's just written a little bit differently than you might expect. So when you see double curly braces, it's literally a type and then an object literal.
And if you choose to use the CSS, like the separate CSS file, would it still be the same thing? So class name is still just a dot, and you can add IDs in as needed, all that good stuff.
Yes.
What's like standard protocol?
You're probably going to see the style objects a little bit more for the most part. It depends on what you're doing. Like if you're invoking, you're using a CSS library, like maybe Bootstrap, then you'll still see the classes used there, but they'll just typically link that in the root of the HTML file. So you don't see as much of this because then you import the header and sometimes you have the CSS and sometimes you don't, and it can be hard to remember which is which. Versus with a style object, you know like exactly that it only applies to the object that you're using. And with a CSS file, you know it's always there. It's when it's sometimes there that it gets a little tricky. So you can be aware, and it's only there when you import header or import the header file. So that's sometimes why people avoid it. Now people can get into some pretty advanced manipulation with these style objects, but ultimately it's just setting the style attribute on the page. That's all we're doing. And remember, you can't do it as a string, you have to do it as an object. And so sometimes for short stuff, people will inline it like we did with card down here, rather than pulling it out into this separate space.
When you did it inline there, why are there two sets of curly braces around that first one?
Yeah, so these first sets of curly braces are just to say, hey, we're using JavaScript now. And the second one is to make it an object that has those properties.
Thank you.
Other questions? Alrighty. So what we're going to have you do is change something from a page that looks like this to a page that looks like this. We're kind of moving towards, I don't know, more of a Pan-African color scheme going on right here. And we're also changing the position and the font size and some other pieces as well. And we want you to do that using some of the CSS techniques we just looked at. Now, we also detail for you what the styles are. So like each one of these sort of says, hey, this is green, red, orange, this is the font size, this is how to get the welcome to pin to the right side, etc. And so we want you to use inline styles. And inline styles is what we saw in the nav bar or in the card where we're setting a style object and just putting it there. So we want you to modify each one of these so that they have those style objects overriding what's there. So currently each component is styled using imported external style sheets. We want you to, without altering any of the CSS files, update each one of the components using inline styles so that you're overriding what happens there by default. We're going to have you work on this for the next, let me pull this up real quick. The next 10 minutes. If you have questions, let us know. After that, we're going to take a look at props a little bit, and then we'll continue from there. We'll probably save state more for tomorrow. Cool. If you have any questions, let us know. We're going to open up the breakout rooms. Good luck. All right, folks. Looks like everyone's back, so let's go ahead and take a look at these different pieces. We had app.js, and based off of the preview image we had over here, we wanted it to look in a particular way. So let's start out with the nav bar. So it's green up at the top, and we want to justify the content to the end. It's already display flex, we just need to change some pieces about it. So let's go up to our nav bar, and let's say const styles equals some object. You can name this whatever you want, but people often name it styles and then have any of the specific styles for the site that they want, or for the component that they want embedded in here. So we're going to call this navbar style. Again, you could call it whatever you want. You could even have inlined it. I'm just showing you some of the ways that some people do it. We're going to set the background to be green. And we're going to say justify content. Again, we see we don't have a dash. We just use uppercase the next letter. And we'll justify content to flex end. And now we need to apply it. So for this nav, we're going to say that the style equals, switch over to JSX expressions, and we're going to say styles.navbar style. Could you have just inlined it here? Sure. Could you have just said style and then put it here without making an extra layer? Sure, but it's very common to see something like this, especially as you get more and more properties that you want to set. So making sure that we've got our terminal working, we can see that it's green, the content's justified to the end, so we're good to go with our navbar. Cool, so let's look at the header next. So for the header, we had a couple of things. We needed to set the background to be red, and we also wanted to set the font size of the H1 to be 100 pixels. All right, so I'm going to start out with const styles, and who wants to help me out after that?
I went super generic and did the first one, the first style header with a background of red.
Header style, background red, and then what?
Then I did H1, but it could be H1 style.
Sure. I usually say heading, or you could have said H1 style. Like, it's honestly fine. Let's go with H1 style. And we'll set the font size to be what?
100 px.
100. So by default, the font will say pixels. You could also have written it like this. Both are equally valid. And now for my header, the style equals styles.header style. Then we'll have style equals styles.h1 style. Let's check it. Font size went up, background changed to what we wanted. Excellent. I'm just going to finish out this last one for us real quick with section. There's a lot of different pieces in there. And I'm just going to inline this one because it's only one property. The reason people like to put it up here, like const styles, is because it's also easy to just go find it. You don't have to go digging through the document to find where things are set necessarily. But just to sort of provide a counter example of what you can do, we're just going to come over to our section, class name section, style equals double curly brackets, background, orange. So you'll see both. Best to be fluent in both, and then follow the convention of whatever the project is. If it's your project and you get to choose whichever one you're more comfortable with. Most people generally like the styles object as a separate thing. Makes it easier to refactor later. Or extract stuff out and pull it out. The only exception I would say is usually if you're doing something like display none, where you're just turning something on and off initially. Then you might see a little bit more of this stuff. But you can also just do this really quick to try out a style with React. So let's come back here, and we see that our website styles have now been adjusted. Excellent. So that sort of shows us that we can pass in the style prop. We were passing props into our divs and our spans, but we can also pass props into our components themselves. And we can do things with those props. It's kind of like we did when we were looking at rendered views from before. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to look at number 10, instructor props demo. I'm going to go ahead and copy the source file right here. I'm going to go ahead and delete the old one. Copy that one in there again, and let's take a look at this. So this is an alert, and it says invalid user ID or password. Now, if we look at it, just looks like has some of the standard stuff. It's bootstrap, it's got a class of alert specifically danger, which is giving it the red, and then some text, invalid user ID or password. Cool. However, I've got a React plugin here, and let's look at the component. You see that we have an app alert, and it's got some different properties. One of them is called children, invalid user or ID or password, and one of them has a type of danger. So this is app, this is an alert, and in fact, if I come back here and I look at the structure of my application, my app has an alert property with a type danger. What's setting the children property? Remember, the children property is invalid user ID or password. So what's setting the children property?
Is it the actual alert?
The components?
Yeah, it's whatever between the opening and closing tag is your children components. It's a little bit special. It's the only one like that, but it enables us to just write it like, hey, I've got an alert. It's a danger alert, and it's an invalid user ID or password. And so I can just put my message straight in there. So the message is, or the children, or the specially named children prop is just what's between the opening and closing tags. That's how we set those. And then the type, and in fact all the other ones, is set like a property. So if I come in here and I say, what about a bing bong equals hello world, and I refresh the page, and I look at this component again, I now have a prop called what about a bing bong with the value hello world that I'm passing to this prop or to this component. Now, how do I use those? Nowhere in here do we see, you know, what about a bing bong hello world? And that's because you can pass props to a function and it doesn't have to use it. Let's look at how it's actually going to use it. And we'll take off what about a bing bong for now. Got nailed earlier when people were like, yeah, you'll say that a lot. And I'm like, I do, I really do. So let's go into alert-js. So here's my function, and alert, we get this thing called props, and it's just a function argument. It's just an object full of those different properties. So I can say props.type, props.children. If I wanted to go back and say, hey, what's props.what about a bing bong? I could. This doesn't need to be named props because it's a function argument. It doesn't need to be named props, but that's what we call it. And so it's almost always labeled props in some capacity. And so we've got props.type and props.children. And we can see now why that's displayed in between the opening and closing div. It's because we said, let's put that there. And then we can see here that, let's break this down. So our class name is going to be alert. And then here's where we're using a template string, which is why we see the $sign again. The class name is alert and alert-props.type, or if a props.type isn't set, we default to success, and then the rest of it like normal. So this is us taking those props and being able to apply them in any way we want, just like their function arguments. So we get an object. So let's look at these two side by side. So all of our attributes, whether that's type equals danger, or what about a bing bong equals hello world, get passed as properties of this object, which we label props because it's just full of all the properties, and saying properties over and over again sounds dumb. So we say prop and props. So these attributes are properties of this object. Also, special case, this is a property called children that's passed along on this object. So if I want to use this here, I could say props.children, and then right after this, I could say props dot wada bada bing bong.
Where
Now, if we come back to this page, it's just going to put hello world right after it, assuming I saved everything correctly.
Do we need
Oh,
to
I
install?
bet I didn't save my app. There we go. And then there's
Eric,
hello world right after it. Yes.
do we need to install the React Dev tools so we can see that
Yes.
component?
So the way that you have this pop up is you have to install the React Dev tools, which you can just Google for it. Like if you search like Chrome React Dev tools, you'll get the plugin I was showing you.
How does in the alert.js, how do the props get passed into that? Because only thing I'm seeing is just import React. So how are they talking from app.js to?
For sure. So see how we're importing alert? JSX translates this to a function call.
Got it.
So the JSX is the part translating this. So because these are attributes, it receives these as props. And we'll see that it works a little bit differently when we use class components, but not that differently. And the only one that's kind of weird is children. And that's so that we can continue writing it like it's a div or something else like that. It's just something that has that content in it. And so that enables us to just put that right here. Now, if we change the type, or we take the type off, for example, then it's going to default to success. So invalid user ID or password is going to turn green at this point. Or I can say that the type equals warning. And now it'll be yellow because I'm tying into my different classes. So the idea behind this is now I've, in a sense, kind of made my own element. I've made my own element and I can decide how it acts and how it looks by using props, which is pretty cool because I can start abstracting away from this. And this is just so that now no one else needs to know how this alert works. They just say, hey, we have an alert. It's styled the way that we want. You just set the type to be like success or warning or danger, and it'll act appropriately, and you don't need to know anything else. You don't need to know the implementation details of it. So I can start using these components and go, yeah, I guess we should have an alert here. And I don't need to worry about how to write all of that to present it. It's just, here's an alert component. That's where it goes. So it's like we get to make our own elements, which is really cool. Any questions or any more questions? Alrighty. So what we're going to do next is we're going to try and apply that. We want to pass in custom pieces of information. So we're going to go to number 12, skipping over 11, props calculator. And let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So I'm going to have a list of friends here. And you'll probably recognize these folks. So I've got 3 friends under the seat. And the way that I'm writing these is I have 3 different components, but you'll notice there's some overlap. If we're thinking about the drive principle, where are we repeating ourselves?
Card, name, occupation, location.
For sure. So we have, it's pretty much all the same. The only thing that's different is the picture and then some of the text corresponding with it. It's the same basic structure. And in fact, if I look at this with my components view, just gotta wait for this to finish because it should be showing up now. There we go. You'll see that I've got a wrapper, a title, and the SpongeBob card, the Mr. Krabs card, the Squidward card. Currently, they're not making use of any props. But I could see that it would be helpful if I could pass in the name, the occupation, the location, the image itself of these, because then I could use the same component over and over again with different data, with just different props being passed in. So we have some data for you to use to work with that. It's in friends.json. So if I want to access these different pieces, and we can just hard code it for now, tomorrow we'll learn more about how we can do stuff with lists, but something I could do is I could just say, oh, inside of app.js, you'll see that we can just say import friends JSON from dot slash, dot slash, I have to go up a level. That should be from dot slash friends JSON. To make sure that we're doing that correctly, I'm just going to say console.log friends JSON. Great way to check yourself. Let's come back here, check our console, and there's our 3 friends. So SpongeBob should get friends 0 because that has all the information about SpongeBob. Mr. Krabs should get friends 1 because that has all the information about that, etc. And we want to pass this in. So we've got a name, an image, a location. We can see all of that. And in fact, we don't really need the ID now, but we will later when we make it a little bit more generic. Real quick, let's look at wrapper and title just to sort of emphasize some of the stuff we've got here. So wrapper doesn't do much. Let's look at it. It takes a prop of other components. So not just text, but actual other components, and it puts it between there. And all it does is it puts a class wrap around all of that. So that's what gives it some space. So the wrapper is just a nice formatter, and then it's got each one of these other pieces inside of it. So it says, hey, I've got this space. I'm just sort of blocking out a square or a rectangle for everything to be in. And if we look at title is doing the same thing just with friends list, some text. So your children can not only be text or native elements, they can actually be other components that you want to embed inside of each other. Cool. So, but let's bring it back to your assignment. This is going to be the last thing we work on today. We're going to be going over it first thing in the morning tomorrow to just kind of review it. But we want to give you the opportunity to practice this, break it up into different pieces. What we want is a single card or a single component, let's call it a friends card, that does all of this. Now in here, you'll see that they have a style.css. This one has a style.css. This one has a style.css. Here's the dirty secret. They're all the same style.css, right? So you won't need to change that. So what I would do is pick one of them, like Mr. Krabs, copy, paste the folder, make it a new one, and then try and change it so that you're using the friends card instead. If you have questions or you're still running into issues, let us know. We'd love to help you out. The README has a little bit more information. All of the info that you need. Let's open up the correct one here. Is inside of the friends.json. Talks a little bit about how all of these different things are related, how you can import friends, how you can console.log them out, etc. All right, cool. So we're going to open up the breakout rooms, and then tomorrow we'll be reviewing this and then also introing the idea of state. So far, all of our websites have been pretty static, and even if we have a static website, we've seen some benefits from writing apps this way, just in being able to separate the functionality into different pieces. But we'll be looking more at state tomorrow. So opening up the breakout rooms, like I say a million times before it happens. Good luck. So it is office hours at this point. We're going to take a few minutes just to get everything set up if you're still running into issues or you just have questions that you need one-on-ones. Those wait lists are open at this point, so you can go ahead and sign up for a slot on that. In the main section, we're just going to be kind of looking at React some more, messing around with it a little bit to get more used to it, and we'll be going over the activity first thing in the morning. So if you want to practice more, get used to it more, you certainly can, and have an opportunity for that. And then if you can't stick around for office hours, we're going to review it so you're not going to miss anything. So we'll be getting started on that in about 2 minutes just to get set up. We'll see you then.
Y'all liking React more than the database stuff like me?
More than the database stuff, yeah.
That's because you love front end, Steven. He's like smiling, grinning from ear to ear.
Do. It's fun. I really like this. I mean, I think it's just with what you get and what you understand. And it's like, I'm super jealous of the people that got the database backend stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you, Steven. I like this much better.
It's like, it's sad because it's as soon as this is over, it's like, cool, I really like the React and the front end stuff, but I don't get to do that because I got to learn the database stuff. So let's review that.
Oh, yeah.
So Daniel, you're going to go back and redo your like homepage about you page with React now?
I still haven't done like any of the, like the two things I haven't done is update the Bootstrap one. So probably, I guess maybe. I mean, yeah, because I guess you can still use Bootstrap and React. Maybe it's a good thing I haven't kept redoing my portfolio, because it's like, redo it. Oh, but now you know something new, redo it again. Now you learn something new, redo it again. It's like, why don't you just teach me everything and then I'll redo it once?
I didn't think this one would be too bad, because it's almost like you make your files and your folders for the React, and then you copy and paste over your HTML stuff into JS files. And it's like, yeah, you don't need React to do a resume or a profile page, but you can use it.
Yeah, I almost think like you can make like multiple pages or projects, one that's like Bootstrap heavy and one that's React heavy. Because the main thing is just to show your potential employee, like, what do you want me to do? React, Bootstrap? Maybe it's like
versatility.
Is it minimal.cs? Is that another CSS framework?
I know what you're talking about. I've seen it pop up in my Googling.
Materialize, that's what it is. Thank you, Christian.
Alrighty, folks. My cat ran out the door, so it took a little bit longer than I thought it would, but we're back for office hours. Questions?
So is it important to use JSON type file for like we are with this last activity for that reason, or can other files be used and referenced?
You can reference other stuff, but most of the time, if you're going to use static files like that, it's going to be JSON. More often than that, you're actually going to be loading in information from like an AJAX call of some kind. We just haven't learned how to do that yet, so we're working with a JSON file. But for example, something that you could do is you could, for example, you could say like, hey, restaurant owner, let's make a menu. And anytime you have to, you could teach them just enough to be like, hey, here's how you make a new menu item and put it in JSON, or you could build a little tool that just output that or something like that for them. Where, and then they, as long as they have access to like a file upload or something like that, they can update it on GitHub to add or remove or correct typos or things like that. So it's not a bad way for somewhat less technical people to work with it, or you can build some other thing that looks at like a Google Sheet and converts that to a JSON file or something like that. So as long as people could fill in the spreadsheet correctly, you can update information on your website.
So there's way to code it where you can have a form that information you put in that form will push the information into a JSON file. We know that, but then also being able to like add a line of a object code into these like app.js files.
Yeah, so you could do one of two things. You could, well, what I honestly would do is I would make a little function that just called a serverless function that went and looked at a Google Doc or something like that. So it would ultimately probably end up looking like at an API call, but if you really just do have static info, it's easy to work with it as a JSON file. Now, 99% of the time, it's going to be an API call or something like that, but right now we're doing a stand-in for that because we don't have that yet. We haven't learned how to put that inside of React because we haven't introduced state yet, which we'll do tomorrow. By the end of tomorrow, you'll know how to do that stuff.
And are you done, Stephen? Like a different thing.
Yeah, no, I'm done with that. I had more complicated questions, but they're a little consequence.
Yeah. So I don't know why this isn't clicking with me, and it should, but the props for this example, that we're working on. I still don't understand how the props gets to the index or where it comes from.
For sure. So the main thing to realize here, let's look at let's grab one of the examples here. So the props demo, like we see right here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at alert and app. And the fundamental thing to realize is that alert is a function, and we just write it a little bit different so people remember it's a component. So alert is a function, and under the hood, it's being turned into a function by JSX. So this is the function name. We are calling the alert function, and the different props, we've got a type equal to danger, and children is equal to this. That's a more what you might see if you weren't using the JSX of it. And so we can specify, if I specify another thing like extra equals hello, it's like I'm adding another entry in here. Where I'm just calling a new object based off of all of those pieces. It's just written syntactically a little differently because we want it to look like HTML. And so we're returning this. Let's close this really quick. And we'll stack these on top of each other. So when I call this alert function, it gets these props, which again, props is going to look just like this object. And then I can use that here. Now this might throw you a little bit, but this is just a template string that's essentially saying alert dash something or success. So another way that let's take off the or success, so it just doesn't have a default. So whatever props type is danger. If it's danger, it's going to turn this into div class name equals, and then that evaluates to alert dash danger. Like so. And then, so along with whatever
children in there.
This is. And then this gets returned to the app. The app gets returned to the React DOM render function, and then that gets put on the page. Does that help?
It does, yeah. I just have to look through this new example with that in mind to wrap my head around it.
It's new. It's a little weird. You can think of it just as these are entries on an object. But that's the translation we're working with, essentially. This translates to this. If it helps, you could even break out the pieces where you say like const props equals this, and we're calling alert with props. Except we need those there. So these two are, this is essentially the JSX version of that. It's really a little bit more complicated than that, but not too much more. Other questions? And I think working on the activity will help you out with that too.
For this activity, is there a way in the app.js file to do a for each function?
There is, and we're going to talk about that more tomorrow.
Okay. Cool.
But you don't have to do it. You can just hard code the first one to be friend 0, the second one to be friends 1, or whatever.
Okay.
And what I would do is actually set it to be property. So you don't pass in the friend 0 object. You'll pass in like friend 0.name, friend 0.occupation, etc. As that'll keep it a little bit more generic. But either way, honestly, works.
Is there a way to go around your props when you do the card to prevent it from having to do .children in front of everything first?
What do you mean .children in front of everything?
So I made the card, but I had to do my props on my card is I get it children first, and then after that I get the array of everything. So when I put in, friend 0, I have in my card, I have to do props.children.name.
Oh, is that because you're passing it in like this? Like that or something?
Yeah, that's how I'm passing it in.
Yeah, don't do it that way. Is the short answer. The easier way to do that would to be just pass in something here, like because now you're passing in that prop directly. And it's just labeled props dot occupation or ASDF or whatever you type there. So you can see how we're doing that with app.js. We're only passing some stuff there. And it turns out we don't need to pass much of it in there. We can just pass the properties we want as that by itself. So children works best for other components or text that's literally going to be written in the HTML by itself. It doesn't work so well for data or by itself. So like, and I'm resisting the urge to do it now because if I do it now, I won't do as good of a job explaining it tomorrow because in the back of my brain, I'll be like, you just explained this. So it's hard to work around that. That's just my own foibles as a person coming to bear. But setting them as properties like this, where you have like friend card occupation equals friend 0.occupation, and then the other ones like their name, their image, is a better route to go rather than trying to embed them all in there with children. And there's also destructuring and other stuff you can do to make it even crazier, which is fun. So I guess let's give y'all a taste of what we're going to get to. So don't worry if you don't understand all of this. I'm not expecting you to. In fact, we're going to spend the next couple of days working up to something like this. But let's use my favorite example. And let's just delete the practice app for right now. Let's delete the friends.json. And inside of app.js, I'm just going to start out with return div. And we'll get rid of all of that stuff. So what I want to do is, let's say that I want to get a list of movies, because that's all we do. It's just a view library, but let's say that we want to get a list of movies from the OMDB API that match a certain name. Let's just pick that name for right now. Let's say const movie equals Frozen. Later, if we have time, we'll make it so that we can actually choose the name, but let's just assume we can't for right now. And we're going to learn how to do this first using class components, but I'm going to skip ahead to even further in the week about this. And I'm going to say const movies, set movies equals use state array const, or no, it's going to be use effect. Axios. Well, first of all, we're going to need to install Axios so that we can use it. Let's pause that. And yarn, you could also have written just npm install Axios, same thing. Axios.get https. Movie and API key equals trilogy dot then response set movies response. Well, let's console.log that out. There we go. Still starting. Use state is not defined. Oh, right. And then I forgot to import Axios too. Software development, right? Cool. And let's look at search. Data.search. So now I can look at my state, and my state has all of this information, and we're kind of doing the activity at this point, but let's go ahead and make another component. We'll call it movie. We'll say import React from React function movie return div movie placeholder module.exports equals movie.
You need to capitalize that M in the exports.
There we go. Let's go ahead and import the movie component from /component/movie. And let's just go ahead and put one right here. All right, so I come back here. Components movie. Did I just export it? Yeah, I did the require. Wrong way to do it. movie placeholder. Yay, we're done, right? No. So I'm going to take in a props object. I'm going to be kind of cheeky about it. You probably shouldn't actually do this, but that's what every teacher says before they do something. They're like, I'm going to do it because I'm special, right? Let's see, let's say, so let's handle the case if there is no movies. So let's say movies.length is equal to 0. If that's the case, then we're going to say, sorry, no movies to display. If that's not the case, we'll put a movie component. So it's going to start out saying, sorry, no movies to display as it first loads. And then once the data loads in, it'll flip it over. So that'll help me because now, let's see. We'll just go dot, dot, dot. So now if we look at my movie placeholder in the components view, it's getting all of these properties: poster, title, type, year, IMDb ID, whatever. And I can use these properties. So let's say class name equals card. We'll go borrow some cards from Bootstrap. Like this one. Actually, let's generic it up even more. New file card.js. Import React from React function card props. Export default card. And this is a little bit of overkill for what we're doing, but whatever. Return class name, image equals, source equals, props.image. And then our card body, instead we're going to say, props.children. I think that's fine. Apparently it's not. Oh, and then we need this. And our alt text will be props.alt. So now our movie, we're going to use a card here, and we'll set some of the properties. So actually we'll do this card / card. Here's some text, or I guess that would be props.plot probably. And we'll set some other properties like the, what did we name it? Image is equal to props.poster, and the alt is equal to props.title. And let's go back to our page. Oh, and then style. We'll just fix that like we did before. There's Frozen, and oh, it doesn't give us the plot. So we'll just put the title in the year instead. So there it is. Cool, we got a movie about it. Let's do that for a bunch of them. Movies.map, movie, and we'll movie. I'm using the word movie too much. I realize this, but style equals display. So it can do something like that. Where it shows, it just does each one of those, and then you could add other properties to this. Flex wrap. What is the property for that? It's flex wrap. Wrap. Max width 100%. And then you get kind of that tiling look, and it just loads all of that. And I guess we could do one more piece up at the top, just to kind of show you what we're building towards. And this is me using also a lot of the tricks I know for this. This isn't necessarily the same place you'll get with a bunch of it. So I need another piece here, and let's say const title set or search, set search equals use state Frozen search. And instead we'll put search right there. And then we'll do some quick updates on here. So I'll put a input text value equals search, on change equals e set search e dot target dot value. I think that'll do it. So currently this is us looking for Frozen. Let's look for the matrix. Oh, I broke something real bad. Cannot read property length of undefined. Set movies. If response.data.search. There we go. All right, so let's try the matrix. So just update as you type. Now, if we were being good about it, we would actually throttle that Type in and get a bunch of stuff that way. But the problem right now is it's doing that whenever we type it, and we want to throttle that a little bit. So let's see. Have to look up how to do that. React throttle. Look, do they have one built in? No, it's yeah, outside of the scope of what we're doing right now. Yeah, we'll look at that later. We'll actually see an example of debounds. I just don't want to hand implement it right now or install more stuff. So that's kind of what we're moving towards, where you can just sort of type in whatever you want, and it'll update that, and then that could be a series of links that takes you to learn more about that if you wanted, all sorts of fun stuff.
So I got a warning when I use the map function on mine.
Oh, I have that warning too.
Okay, I was going to ask. It says something about a key prop.
I think that'll do it. Key prop, and then each one of those movies is getting IMDb ID. Okay, almost. Capital D. Yeah. So let's talk about that real quick, and we'll close on that. And let's get rid of the console.log. Where is that console.log? It's probably in card. Is it in movie? It's in movie. Class, name, and class name. Where do we see class? I did. So remember that what we're trying to do with the virtual DOM is we're trying to make diffs between different pieces. What this is asking for with those keys is a way for it to distinguish all of those different members of an array, so that if one of them changes, it just has to update that single one. So it's a performance enhancing. It'll still work, but you're going to potentially have slower updates if you don't provide a unique key value for it, which in our case, since we know each movie should be unique, we're using the IMDb ID. So there shouldn't be any overlap.
So as long as you have some component set to key that is unique between each of them, it won't throw that warning.
Right. So usually you're using the ID of whatever thing you're basing it off of. Trying to think if there's anything else cool we can do. Well, we could get we could do that. It'd be better to do that when we can debounce it, but this is something we're moving towards. We'll talk about a different way of doing this first, kind of an older way of doing it, which has to do with using classes and lifecycle events, but we'll talk about that a different time. Let's see. And I don't want to hand implement use debouncer right now. Actually, Yeah, I do. Let's do it. Okay, so this is going to be a custom hook. So I'm going to make a new folder called hooks. We'll make a new one here and we'll just call it use debounce.js. Or React. Use effect from React. And we're going to use our good friend set timeout. So whenever we're making our own custom hooks, they can use other hooks, but they have to be invoked in special places. So what we're going to do is that's what the default value is. Then we're going to use effect. And again, don't worry about understanding this yet. We will approach this a little bit at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a timeout where we eventually update it after people have timed something. And we're going to, yeah, that's right. And then we're going to return a new function, clear timeout handler, and then we'll pass in value or a timeout. Then we'll return the state, and then we'll say over in app.js, import use debounce, or just use debounce, don't need to. From dot slash hook slash use debounce. Then we're going to have to set up something else here. So const debounced search set debounced or debounced search is equal to use debounce the search, and then we'll use that here instead. So now it should wait until we're done typing for a second before it calls anything. So now let's refresh the page. And now rather than get everything in between, I'm just going to say the matrix, and then after a full second, it'll actually make the call and it should update everything, which it does. We just need to make sure that use effect knows to rerun when that changes. So let's say Frozen 2, let's say face off. And so it'll wait a second before it tries to do that. So like the mask, and there it goes. Now, most of the time, for something like use debounce, you can just use a library. You don't have to hand implement it. But all this is doing is it's saying, all right, you have a value, and what we're going to do is we're only going to update this value after the timeout has happened, and we're going to clear last. If you call this again, we're just going to clear it again, essentially. So we'll talk about this more later in the week, but you're starting to see some of the cool stuff you can do with React, where things just update because you've updated the state. But we're getting there gradually. We're getting there gradually. Right now, we're just working on props. We're working on building the pieces, and we'll go forward from there. All right, it's already 3:13. So any final questions to close us out with? The problem is every time I do a little bit of this, I keep wanting to add a new feature to it, and then office hours just keeps going. We'll resist the temptation today. Oh, and a lot of times we would actually break this out into its own file as well. All right, hold on. Sorry, I can't help myself. I can't help myself. Let's go utils. Let's make a new file called api.js. And this will help us a little bit. Let's go ahead and make a new file. Module dot export default object. Get movies. Title. Then response.data. Then we'll do get movie by ID question mark IMDb ID. This switches over to and we put IMDb ID, and this is just going to be title. So now I can call import API from /util/API, and we can say API.get, what did we label that? Export default const API equals, then we need a period there. API dot get movies, debounced search. Then we'll take our response and then we'll say if response.data.search and this would actually just be movies. Or if movies.search. And we might actually set it up so that it rejected it if that didn't work. But if movies.search const movie details equals promise.all movies.map movie, we'll close the API for now. API dot get movie by ID movie dot IMDb ID geez. Set movies. Details. Response is not defined. That's right. Oh, exports. That should just be export. Default. I think we can get away with just this. Oh, we need Axios. Import Axios from Axios. Movies.map is not a function. All right, that should be movies.search.map. Cool. But fortunately now our movie is actually getting a lot of data because we hit our API and asked for all of it as well. So we could put things like, let's go to the movie and just say H1, or we could set this up as card titles by modifying our card property, and then P would be props.plot. Like so. And you could just keep working on that as much as you wanted. So now you can work on what each one of these look like, apart from the data and everything else, and you're just getting all of the info that you need for each one. So you could use this to do all sorts of things. You could make it a quiz game where you're guessing how much money each one made. You could sort by box office numbers or all sorts of fun stuff. And this is what I like to call use all the techniques that we've talked about. So we're not going to ask you to do anything like that or like it, but we're not going to ask you to just bang it all out, write that one after another. That's kind of putting everything together at once. But it looks cool, and it shows you the kind of ability that you're able to get to when you use React, because there's a lot of cool pieces that are just out there for you to use. All right, and with that, I think I'm done. I have to stop myself before I want to fidget more with it, because I'm incurable that way. All righty, if there's no more questions, it was lovely seeing y'all. We'll see you all tomorrow when we review talking about props and we start to talk a little bit about state. Should be a lot of fun. Have a good one.